So topic three looks really short, but it does need a decent explanation to go into it. So for topic three, we're going to look at multiplying a series of integers. We already know that if we're multiplying two integers that have the same sign, the product is positive. So whether those two integers are positive or negative, you're going to get a positive product. If you're multiplying integers that have different signs, that's always going to give you a negative product. And that's going to play a really important part in what we look at here. So when you're multiplying a series of integers, that means you could have multiple integers that are positive or negative. And so when you have a situation like that, you always want to count the number of negatives. So how many negatives do we have? Okay. So if you have an even number of negatives, that's going to give you a positive product. And hopefully, if you really sit down and think about that, that kind of makes sense. Every two negatives will make a positive. Okay. So if you have an even number of negatives, each group of two negatives pair up, they become positive, and then at the end of the day, you're just multiplying a series of positives. And that's the cool thing about even numbers, they're always going to pair up by twos, okay? Now, if we have an odd, let me highlight this one in green. If we have an odd number of negatives, that's going to give us a negative product. And again, if you think about that, that kind of makes sense. When you have an odd number of things, they'll always pair up in twos, except there's going to be one left over. So imagine a family that has five kids. They have a group of two kids. They have another group of two kids, but then there's that one kid that doesn't have a buddy to pair up with. Okay. That's what's happening here. So when you have an odd number of negatives, every group of two negatives pairs up to become positive, but there's that one negative at the end that makes the whole thing negative. Okay, so you always want to start by counting the number of negatives, and then that's going to tell you what the final sign is. If you have an even number of negatives, your final product is positive. If you have an odd number of negatives, the final product is negative. Now, for this first example, I'm going to piece it together. We're just going to multiply from left to right and let the sign be what the sign is. Then we'll go back and verify by counting negatives. Okay. So for example three, it says find each product. Part A, we have -1 times -5 times +4 times -2. So just to prove a point, we're going to go just 2 by 2. So -1 times -5. I'm multiplying two integers that are both negative. Since they have the same sign, their final product is going to be positive. So this gives me +5, and then I just want to bring down the other integers. So I have +5 times 4 times -2. So we're going to go 2 by 2 again. Well, 5 times 4, they're both positive, same sign. Anytime you multiply two integers that are either both positive or both negative, you get a positive product. So that's going to be 20 times -2. And finally, we're multiplying two integers that have different signs. So when you have one positive, one negative, the product is always negative. So that tells me that we're going to get negative 20 times 2, which is 40. So we did this just piece by piece, okay? Now, if we were to go back and count the negatives, how many negatives did we have? Well, let's see. We had 1, 2, 3 negatives. So that's an odd number of negatives. So the first pair of negatives pair up and become positive, but that third negative has no other negative to buddy up with. It makes the whole product negative. Okay. So keep that in mind when you're multiplying a series of integers. Just count the number of negatives, and that's going to tell you really quickly if your product is going to be positive or negative. Okay. Now for part B, it has a trick in it, but let's just look at negatives first. So if we were going to count negatives, we would have 1, 2 negatives, okay? Well, two negatives, that's an even number. Those would pair up and become positive. That would technically give us a positive product, but we have an issue here. So if I look here, hopefully you notice this issue right here of 0. We're multiplying a series of numbers, and one of those factors is 0. So that right there is going to make the entire product 0. Doesn't matter how many positives, doesn't matter how many negatives. If you have a 0 in a list of factors, so a list of numbers being multiplied, the whole product ends up being 0, okay? And that's the multiplication property of 0. Now, if you don't believe that, let's go and do this piece by piece. So let me erase this and we'll go piece by piece. So if we were to go piece by piece, we have 3 times -7. So we've got one positive, one negative. That's -21. All right. So then we want to bring down the other digits or the other factors. So we've got times 0 times -4. Well, -21 times 0, we already know that if you multiply anything by 0, you're going to get a 0 product. So this just becomes 0. And then I get 0 times -4. Well, 0 times -4, again, if you're multiplying and one of your factors is 0, the whole thing is 0. So either way you slice it, you get a product of 0 there. So be really cautious. If you have a string of integers that need to be multiplied, you can just multiply them 2 by 2, or you can just go straight at the top and count how many negatives you have. If you have an even number, know your product is positive. If you have an odd number, know your product is negative, and then multiply. And just never forget to look for those sneaky little zeros. If there's a 0 in there and you're doing nothing but multiplying, that makes your whole product negative, or that makes your whole product a 0.